7-8 History. Today we are in Lesson 2 of Chapter 29. Thank you for all your work commenting and taking the quiz, which was worth a worksheet grade on Lesson 1. Thank you for your work on the limited war risk assessment activity. I hope it made sense and you found it helpful. We left off with both Kennedy and Lejeune being assassinated, so it would be a time for new leadership. We've also been dipping into what we watched in the Vietnam War documentary, and I'd like to begin by working through what we saw in the final 3 episodes, and then we'll just move on using the textbook from there. I'll also go over a review of some of the key terms and people so that we're ready for the next assignment. In episode 3, I forget if this is in the video or if I pulled this from research elsewhere, but if you remember Robert McNamara, they call him here the Whiz Kid American Defense Secretary. He was our defense secretary. You hear from him the most on the tapes between him and Johnson. We learned that already by 1965 he had real concerns about continuing the war, and finally he was basically demoted to being in charge of the country's banks. Anyway, there's archival footage of senior South Vietnamese officers sitting on a stage behind McNamara, and McNamara shouts in Vietnamese, trying to be inspiring in their own language, the popular Saigon slogan, "Vietnam, 1,000 years. Vietnam, 1,000 years." Basically meaning Vietnam will go on and on and on. Long live Vietnam. Trying to, as always, win their respect and win their support by showing we support them. What's amusing about this is kind of like when we learned about Kennedy saying the thing about maybe being a donut. And something you maybe already know about dialects in the East. It doesn't matter the word sometimes, it's how you say it, which is called intonation. And if you use a certain intonation, it means a completely different thing. So instead of meaning what he meant, Vietnam 1,000 years, what it really meant because of his intonation was, the little ducky wants to lie down. The little ducky wants to lie down. Something I thought was pretty funny. Episode 4 was titled Resolve. You watched this with Mrs. Nemi. If you look up the definition for resolve, there's 2 options. Using the second one that Google would give you, I want you to think about why Ken Burns, the director of the video, used that for an episode title at this stage of the war, which is about where we are in the textbook. We learned that in May 1965, the ground troops are deployed. That's also where we are in the textbook. But what's interesting in the video that you don't get from the textbook is the documents that were not released to the public, but were released within the administration that basically outline why are we still going? Why are we deploying ground troops? If up to this point, we've seen very little reason that we will win. And the reasons for going forward are really interesting. Kind of sad, I guess. They say that almost 3/4 of the reason to go and do this and risk all these lives was basically to save face, to show that we can't lose, because we maybe a little bit arrogantly thought we can't be seen as a loser in any scenario. We have to beat them so we look tough. 20% of the reason so that China doesn't bleed into this area, because they too are a concern of ours, a communist country. Only 10% is to actually help the people we're allied with. Interesting. What are some reasons American citizens at home opposed the war? I want you to be thinking about that, especially with the end of today's lesson, where we get a little bit more of that as well. Continuing in episode 4, here are our review on some people we need to keep straight. If you remember Lejeune from last time, a head of the Communist Party and one of the most important North Vietnamese leaders who oversaw the war until reunification of Vietnam was achieved in 1975. I just realized I misspoke at the beginning, and I said that we had ended with the assassination of Kennedy and Lejeune. I meant Guillaume, right, the president down in the south. Lejeune was not assassinated. He's still going, and he was actually largely a secret to the U.S. We always thought of Ho Chi Minh as the one leading the North until we started to learn Lejeune, the head of the Communist Party there, was calling many of the shots and was basically the North Vietnamese leader in a lot of senses. He oversaw the war until 1975, so he's going to be in charge for a long time. Nguyen Cao Ky was the man who basically replaced Guillaume in the South. He was the flamboyant former South Vietnamese Air Force commander who Johnson said he liked him because he acts like an American, but he was really out of touch with the rest of his people. He served for 2 years after Guillaume as South Vietnam's wartime leader. We talked about McNamara. He was Johnson's Secretary of Defense, which means the chief advisor for the military strategy. He's calling the shots for all the generals. Speaking of, General Westmoreland, who was always dead set on, we need to stay here, we need more people, more bombs. He served as our U.S. Army Chief of Staff during the war. He commanded the U.S. forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968. He's kind of the older gentleman with the bushy eyebrows who we see in the video quite a bit at this stage. And then the video, they keep talking about this Denton Crocker, nicknamed Mogi. And you might be confused, why do we hear about him so much? Something that Burns does well in his documentaries, he did in the Civil War documentary, is he likes to highlight at least one quote-unquote regular person who you won't find in a textbook and will not be noted in any study anywhere else, but it's just a chance to see how did the war affect regular people. He was just a regular Army private from Saratoga Springs, New York. Here are some flags to help us keep straight what are all these different groups we hear about. First, there's the NVA, which means Army of North Vietnam. Okay, their flag is up here at the top. It's very basic. Okay, it almost reminds you of the Chinese flag, but it's a star in the middle. Okay, they are officially the army in North Vietnam. Then there's the People's Army of Vietnam, who are also an enemy of ours in the north. Linked and allied together are they with our enemy based in the south, including the NLF we learned about last section. They're more a political entity. I pasted a little flag that looks a lot like NVA's flag. It's got this other little saying in the top left. That's the NLF, the National Liberation Front, and they commission the VC as their military. We call them Viet Cong. Another name for Viet Cong is People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam. They have this flag that looks, again, very similar, but they have the blue stripe at the bottom. That's the Viet Cong flag. They are the ones already in the South, who we find ourselves battling a lot early on. You might hear them referred to as PLAF, same group. Well, who's our ally? That's this flag down here in green. Okay? Our ally is ARVN, sometimes called SVA, Army of South Vietnam, or ARVN stands for Army of the Republic of Vietnam. So there you have them all kind of divided out with flags, if that gets confusing. The last thing you learned about in the video before we had to break for the closure was this Tet Offensive. Unfortunately, you didn't get to see how it resolved in the video, but you will read about it. Ultimately, if you look it up, History.com calls the Tet Offensive a coordinated series of North Vietnamese attacks on more than 100 cities in the south. The offensive was an attempt to, keyword attempt, stir up rebellion among the South Vietnamese population and encourage the U.S. to pull back, be less involved. Now, you might be surprised it didn't completely achieve everything that the North wanted. They probably would have considered this Tet Offensive somewhat of a failure. It certainly did not deliver on all of their expectations and their objectives. When you do get to the Tet Offensive in the book, be thinking about what it would have meant for NVA and VC, to the U.S. and our allies in the South Vietnamese military, and back home with the public. We always want to remember that they were watching everything closely as well. Here's a picture of a B-52 bomber. You also got a picture of that at the beginning of our lesson on page 879, dropping unparalleled amounts of explosives, jellied gasoline called napalm, for a variety of reasons, on Vietnam. By the end of 1960, do you remember how many U.S. military advisors had been stationed in Vietnam? There were just 900, and only 3 years later, remember that number, 16,000, was on our Google quiz last time. Remember what coup means? Short for coup d'etat. It's a French term meaning basically a rebellion, especially with the military, where they take out the leader. Who was taken out in November 1963? The South Vietnamese leader, Diem. Ground troops are just deployed in what year? Do you remember? 1965? And then it just escalates from there. That's the number. Then that's the number in the following year. Then it almost doubles by 1968, 2 years later, until finally the number of troops are slowly scaled back. If you want some interesting reading, you can click this link. You may be surprised its title. It kind of shows where Vietnam is at today. They've scaled back their dedication to traditional communism. They aren't necessarily considered our enemy today. We are more antagonized by other countries. Vietnam is not a public enemy number one. All right, finally, the title of lesson 2 is The Escalation of the War. Are you familiar with the word escalation? To escalate something is to intensify, to increase. If you remember what we called Kennedy's strategy, it was limited war, to not be fully involved. Well, Johnson feared that when Kennedy was out of the picture, that America would be perceived as weaker, less dedicated to the effort, and maybe start to pull back. And he wanted to do the very opposite to prove that that's not the case. So he almost, he saw it as he was inheriting Kennedy's mindset, and we were going to continue, but he almost betrayed the mindset of limited war because he escalates it past. And if the point of limited war was to not have ground troops, well, here we do the opposite with what Johnson called escalation. First, we hear about the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, where we basically antagonized Vietnam to get them to reportedly fire on us so that we'd have our excuse to enter true war with North Vietnam. Some people I've found refer to Operation Rolling Thunder as, and I quote, the dumbest thing ever conceived by mankind. Maybe a very one-sided, opinionated quote, but it's useful to talk about why would anyone ever call it that. The book calls Operation Rolling Thunder a series of airstrikes meant to destroy war industries in North Vietnam. So they're targeting the war industries, kind of like we did in Korea. Opinions will vary, but in the end, we dropped 1 million tons of explosives, and as the last line on page 879 points out, the U.S. effort did not stop the communists' ability to fight the war. And some people would argue we could have seen that coming. Who depends on this Ho Chi Minh Trail to receive their supplies? Remember, the military in the South is technically its own entity. It's still got ties to communism. Okay, don't understand that the Viet Cong is completely different than the NVA. They work in concert. They are a group in the South based, and they receive their supplies from, China, Russia, North Vietnam, all together, by this trail that leads through Laos and Cambodia, these neighboring countries. Interesting picture we'll talk about. Remember we said escalation? Different from the previous policy because we are rapidly increasing involvement and now stationing ground troops, not just advisors, and continuing our bombing raids, escalating those as well, dropping more explosives on Vietnam in like 1 year than that were completely dropped in World War II. You learn on page 880 about, 879, about 880, about how we carried out the war and different sort of approaches. And some of the approaches were called the search and destroy and strategic Hamlet tactics. Westmoreland would search enemy camps and quickly destroy as best he could. His philosophy was the solution in Vietnam: more bombs, more shells, more napalm. The problem, the North Vietnam troops had a local knowledge, as well as Viet Cong, a local knowledge of the landscape around them. They had guerrilla strategies to drag out the war. They had familial connections with the people down there, and especially strategic hamlets. This was a part of a pacification approach where we're going to relocate people from their homes. We're going to put them in different places that we feel are more protective, kind of group them together so we can protect them better. The problem, and this will be in that worksheet, the problem with this approach is people had an almost religious connection to the plot of land that they are on. And we didn't understand this about Vietnamese culture. But when we destroy their houses and we destroy their forests and we destroy their farmland and we take them away from homes and put them somewhere else, we are making ourselves the enemy because they have such an importance placed on that land that has been their families for many, many years. They had a intimate relationship with the land beneath their feet because that was their family's land. And when we used those tactics, we created more enemies than allies. There's a lot to be said about advantages and disadvantages. Of course, we had the superior military might, experience, and wealth, although they did still have alliances with rich countries, didn't they, because of their communism. But there was more disadvantages for us than advantages. The North Vietnamese used the difficult terrain and aggressive guerrilla tactics to hide, attack by surprise, and then vanish into thin air. U.S. soldiers often didn't know who was the enemy, right? They would look at all these people and say, which ones are for us and which ones aren't? Sometimes you'd have to wait until they start shooting at you or throwing a grenade to know who is your enemy. Now, what is this picture of? We were surprised to find later that the Viet Cong had created a vast maze of tunnels beneath the soldiers' feet. Would pop up, pop out, pop down, disappear because they were using these secret trapdoors. And this image is just fascinating. They had a first aid station. They had little peek out doors, even smoke outlets and a kitchen. It's amazing. Drawing water, ammunition, traps to keep people from getting down there. You could sleep down there. I think it's just fascinating. I'd love to learn more about the extensive tunnel systems beneath the soldiers' feet. You have to imagine a U.S. soldier walking through here and not even realizing what's underneath them. I'd laugh to think about, what if they saw a little bit of smoke billowing out of the ground? Or they saw this little top and then they were to discover, what on earth is going on down here? It's amazing. Finally, no safe place. The comment I'd like you to leave in classroom today is to look up the definition for a word hubris. Then explain how the word hubris relates to our approach to the Vietnam War and maybe the problem with our approach. What was the flaw in our pacification efforts? Well, we talked about strategic hamlets, which the book just called civilian areas guarded by our troops where we set people aside. The problem is we would protect, and then at night while the government forces stayed in their camps, the VC came out of hiding, attacked or killed people they believed had helped the South Vietnamese. There was no place for these people to go. They were stuck in these hamlets, and then the next morning they'd wake up and say, you didn't protect us. When U.S. forces would leave a place, they vacated and it all went back to normal. That was the frustrating reality of this war. U.S. atrocities toward innocent South Vietnamese civilians. It wasn't always the VC causing the problems. You learned about Tiger Force, who, our idea was we'll let them kind of go off the grid and fight like the others, like the enemy fights, and sort of let them do their thing. The problem is the leaders allowed for us to commit atrocities. And the average age of soldiers in this war was 22, says the book. So they're not going to have the maturity always to make the right decisions. So when you let people loose in an unsupervised military unit, they're creating enemies again. They're doing terrible things to the civilians. The book talked about destroying a village because, they probably supplied rice to the enemy. Well, you don't know that, and you've actually created a bigger problem when you do that on and on and on. So The atrocities mentioned in the book specifically destroying villages and crops of the innocent civilians because they thought, well, they might belong to the Viet Cong. So, problems suffered at our hands too. That gives you an overlay of Section 2. You should have also already read that. For next time you are completing a activity, it probably won't be a Google quiz, but it features a lot of the review vocabulary that we had at the beginning of today's presentation, and a few questions on topics from today's presentation as well. Thank you for listening.